Professor, I really enjoyed your presentation this morning. Could you tell us why you use the term cosmologies in the title?
Well, I think that the modern era makes itself very special by thinking of science and history as very rational, immediately believable view of the world. But I think they too have a lot of assumptions that we take on faith, much as we did in cosmologies. And in particular, all modern ideas or all modern rationalities, if I may use that expression, are based on some kind of substantive choices that are not reducible to that rationality, right? Ethical choices, which, you know, if you say it's good for human society, you have to tell me why human society is important for you, right? I mean, it's not because, you know, I could make an argument that that society, human society in the Anthropocene destroys the world, right? So that it's much more important to just conserve everything, right? So there are lots of choices that we make, and these have to do with a wider notion of cosmology, which embeds both rationality and the ethical choices that we make, based on some larger understanding that is somewhat transcendent.
I noticed that throughout your presentation, you had a real sense of optimism. Why are you so optimistic at this point?
I think that's also, I mean, optimism, pessimism is both a personal thing, but it's also a cosmological thing. Because, I mean, people who, you know, I'm not a believer, I'm not religious, but what I was talking about at the end was about we need figures of hope. And hope, I think, is a very important philosophical concept that has not been studied. Because hope is something that is, you're in cultural studies, something that is not deconstructible, right? Hope just wells up. You can have certain contents of hope that you can deconstruct, but hope is something that just wells up once, and it just so that's what we have, figures of hope in order to get going. And I think that's the religiosity in me, to the extent that there is.
When discussing the environmental challenges, you use the term shared sovereignty. Why did you use this term, and what's it mean?
Yeah, I would consider it more basic, that hope gives us the idea of a better life and gives us the possibility of going ahead.
Fantastic. Okay, I have one more question. You said, I've got this fantastic phrase here. You said, universal sustainability requires nations to share environmental sovereignty.
Or sovereignty per se, yeah.
Can you maybe just expand on that concept?
Yeah. Well, the idea is that the idea of shared sovereignty, I should go back a little bit. I was once very radically anti-national and believed that, you know, it was the cause of a lot of problems in the world and we've got to change the systems. But I now recognize that the nation state both has served some very important functions. It has succeeded in many cases of bringing people up to a certain level. But at the same time, as an exclusive form, it often depends upon putting down someone else or taking away their resources or something like that, right? Or even just psychologically feeling superior to others, right? And so the idea that, and we are now much more in an interdependent world. And so I think it just makes sense for nation states to recognize, to relax about the competition, recognize the interdependence, recognize the importance of it to save the world, and be able to share in certain critical decisions that affect many parts of the world. Like I brought up the case of water, right? Now, unless governments around the world trust India or Pakistan or China with how they are handling their water so that a secure supply of water can come into the countries which depend on it. How do we know that if you're building a dam out there, you're not going to stop our water, or that you don't have the possibility? You could starve out a whole, you could thirst out a whole nation of people. So it is in that sense that we need transnational agencies at whatever level. And this does mean nations have to sacrifice some of their sovereignty, where others can come in and see and test and examine. The US does this by force, or certain agencies do it by force, like the Atomic Energy Commission and things like that. Certainly, these things exist, but there's a lot of resistance, and we need to expand that kind of organizations, I think, and the power of it, and authorize it with moral power, more than just some Western nations who are powerful at this time.
You discussed public goods and the commons. Do you use the term commons specifically as a way to confront certain environmental challenges and scarcity?
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't know enough about it or the theories, and there's so much to read.
Yeah.
But I think that the issue of commons has to come back in some way and they can come through various channels. And even neoliberal politics has idea of what they call private-public partnership. Now, it's actually very interesting to see what is meant by private-public. Usually we think of it as corporate, the private part being corporate and the public part being government. But it needn't be. And I think they would be open to a lot of community organizing, a lot of NGO participation. Stakeholders, I think, is another notion that is also part of this new vocabulary of the neoliberal order. But those have possibilities, right? And so heritage, I think, is also a very interesting new a concept with huge possibilities, because it's when history spills over into the public realm, away from certain closed institutions, right? And people see this as their heritage, their history as their heritage, and something that can prevent the onslaught of capital from removing, right? But in some ways, most of these issues are sort of one of the most difficult places, of course, for these issues to happen, and yet also not so difficult is China, where there's huge amounts of demolitions all the time and so on. But there are also there emerging a lot of areas. And to some extent, globalization has helped it. All this Twitter and new media and so on have been very important in organizing resistance, in bringing different stakeholders, even in the absence of a community, to create virtual communities of resistance. And they are beginning to, and I think what is very interesting is how governments are being, all over the world, are both being paralyzed and recognizing the impact of this new social media and the flow of information.